They say that the truth catches up to you some way, somehow, right? Well, it would take almost 30 years for one of the most gruesome crimes to finally be solved due to DNA technology. And slowly but surely, with any luck, DNA advancements will continue to catch up to every single last one of these that have been roaming free for decades. Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. It's so greatly appreciate it. Truly, truly is. Before we get started, let me give you my usual disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only. Please do not take what I say as fact. Please always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Next, if you have not liked, subscribed, or commented yet, please consider doing so because it really helps me out and I really, really appreciate it. Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting. I forgot to do it in the last one too. So yeah, I changed the name. It's Angela Grace. So if you see it, it's me. So don't leave me. I had to change the name. I had to make it easier. A bunch of other reasons, but it's Angela Grace now. Okay. Let me warn you in advance that some of the details in this story are incredibly difficult to listen to. November 4th, 1980. Patricia Stapleton and her husband, Robert, go over to the home of Patricia's mother, 73-year-old Mildred McKinney. After Mildred failed to answer her daughter's phone calls, Patricia became worried and went over. At first, she knocked on the door, but there was no answer. So she enters the home. I am thoroughly convinced that what this woman saw that day, she was never able to unsee.
McKinney's shocked neighbors and devastated her daughter, who discovered the body.
And when I got to the bedroom, I could see my mother's legs hanging out from the bathroom.
Mildred's normally neat home was in complete disarray. Drawers were pulled out and her belongings were thrown all over the floor. When she enters her mother's bedroom, she sees Mildred's naked body laying face down on the bathroom floor with her legs outside of the bathroom, and she's underneath a flipped over chair. Tricia runs out of the home and she immediately calls 911. The first officer on the scene was Sheriff's Deputy Duty. Oh my God, I just said Sheriff's Deputy Duty. I did. The first officer on the scene was Sheriff's Deputy Dennis Jarasuski. When he entered the home, he saw what looked like a straight line type blood spray on the walls and the ceiling. Mildred's face had been beaten. There was an alarm clock, the base of a telephone, and a lamp all unplugged and in the middle of her bed. The bed's blanket had dark spots on it, and there was an open jar of Vaseline found near her body, and a small, sticky piece of tape or cord wrapped around her thumb, which that's going to become important later on. Medical examiner Roberto Bayardo testified that the only clothes remaining on Mildred was the left sleeve of her torn, bloody pink nightgown. Her hands were tied behind her back with a white cloth that was torn from a pillowcase, a yellow telephone cord, and a pair of pantyhose. The pantyhose and the cord were tied to her lower leg and opposite ankle. Around her neck, Bayardo found a loose ligature made of a blood-stained strip of her pillowcase. Mildred had extensive bruising to her head, face, and neck, along with bruising from multiple ligatures that were placed on her. Her hands were swollen, bruised, and bloody, leading the medical examiner to believe that her assailant stomped on her. There was sperm and an object the size of a baseball bat inserted into her front privates, as well as the same size inserted into her back privates. Mildred was also alive when these injuries occurred. She had an object shoved into her mouth, and Bayardo concluded that Mildred's cause of death was associated with forcible R word, with her time of death being somewhere around 3 to 5 o'clock in the morning. At the scene, detectives collected hair, clothing, ligatures, bedding, and other evidence that they sent over to the crime lab. After the investigation concluded, Mildred's granddaughter went through the home and made a list of missing items that included silver tea set, traditional coffee and tea set, cream and sugar bowl, a pewter, dark wood handled coffee and teapot, sterling silver cream and sugar bowl, similar pieces monogrammed with F, platinum wedding band with diamonds, white gold ring with diamond chips, gold band with setting for 5 rubies, and a gold wristwatch. In 1981, the supervisor of DPS took samples from a man by the name of Brian Charles Pittman, but he was ruled out shortly after that. In 1983, Williamson County Sheriff Jim Boutwell brought in known serial killer Henry Lee Lucas for an interview. Okay, so Henry Lucas is probably best known for being responsible for the 1981 death of John Walsh's 6-year-old son, Adam, while he's at the Sears department store with his mom. And I remember being a kid. First of all, I loved America's Most Wanted as a kid. I still do. But, like, I remember being a kid and... Because, look, let's just keep it real. In the 80s, you watched America's Most Wanted, and it didn't matter. Like, you were a kid, and you watched it, and that's just what you did. I watched Nightmare on Elm Street also when I was a kid, okay? Like, it was the 80s and the 90s. That's what we did. Kids don't do that these days. But I digress. I remember that story. And then I remember finding out that it was this guy not long ago. Maybe within the last 10 years, I found out who, like, it was a long time before they found out. Anyway, it doesn't, I'm sorry, I'm going on this tangent. So, he tells him that he wants to talk to him about the Interstate 35 bodies. So, this was an investigation about a number of women who were found on the side of the highway between Oklahoma and Laredo. Lucas would commit these crimes with his known associate, Otis Toole, and Toole's niece and nephew. Lucas would also end up being dubbed the false confessor because he confessed to more than 200 that were later found to have been physically impossible for him to pull off. Sheriff Jim Boutwell would end up developing like a good working rapport with him over the years. And I'm sure it's because he spent so much time listening to his false confessions. I'm just saying. In November of 1983, officers got permission for Lucas to get on a conference call with Toole, who was serving time in Florida. While on the call, Lucas asks Toole if he remembers an old lady in a house with gray hair and furniture stacked on top of her body. To which Toole replies, "I'm puzzled on that one." Lucas says, "I am too, because I can't recall it myself. So maybe that's neither one of us. I don't know." So at this point, they should have put Lucas and Toole on the back burner of the suspect list and started looking elsewhere. Okay? In December of 1983, law enforcement showed Toole the crime scene photos from McKinney's home, and Toole confesses to it, to being responsible for it, in a written statement. In 1983, law enforcement showed Toole the crime scene photos from McKinney's home, and Toole confesses to it in a written statement. He says that he, his niece, his nephew, and Lucas were all traveling through Austin, Texas, when Lucas spotted a brick house. He says that an older woman came to the door in her nightgown and they forced their way inside. He says that he beat her until she was unconscious, and then they carried her into the bedroom, tied her up with a foam cord and pantyhose, and then they both R-worded her. He says they put furniture on top of her, looked for gas to start a fire, and robbed her of money, jewelry, silver, coffee pots, sugar, and cream pitchers. In January of 1984, Sheriff Jim Boutwell showed Lucas the crime scene photos, and he gave a very similar videotaped confession to Toole. Lucas says that they were with a third person that he refused to mention, while Toole said they were with his niece and his nephew. Okay, here's the issue that I have. And I get this was the 80s. Okay, but we're not talking 10, 20, 30 years ago. We're talking about 3 years after this happened. We're talking about people that are known liars. But regardless, we're talking about something that happened 3 years later. You're telling me you don't remember that 3 years after it happens? I call bullshit. They should have remembered it immediately. The fact that neither one of them remembered it should have spoke volumes. So why are you showing them crime scene photos? Last time I checked, okay, and I've watched a lot of these. I've researched a lot of them too. Watched even more. But isn't the perpetrator supposed to tell you what nobody else would know rather than you tell them? That's the impression I was always under. You keep certain things under wrap, and if they know what nobody else knows, that's your man, that's your woman. Why are you showing them photos? In March of 1984, Toole gave another written confession, and in May of 1984, Lucas gave a second videotaped confession. Now, granted, I don't know if there was a method to their madness by showing them photos, but I do know that science says they were not the ones that did it. The lab found that Lucas's hair had the same general characteristics as the hair in evidence, but that there were significant differences. Toole was found to probably be a non-secretor because they were unable to produce blood group substances in his bodily fluids. Then in 1996, Sheriff Richards asked Sergeant Briggs to reopen the McKinney case file. CODIS programmer, which is the DNA program, I believe, CODIS, Gary Molina, uploaded cuttings from the sticky ribbon found on her thumb and found that it contained sperm cells along with samples from her nightgown and had a DNA profile built by 1999. You also have to remember, I guess, at this point, I think it was really in its infancy. Detective Briggs asks for the evidence from the scene to be compared to McKinney's son-in-law, Robert, to which he refused. Normally, I would have said, oh, that he did it, he's the one, why wouldn't you give up your DNA if you had nothing to hide? But knowing the outcome of the story, I'm going to say that he probably refused this request because he was either, number one, genuinely insulted that he was being accused of this crime he didn't commit, or he knew his rights and he was like, now get a warrant. I'm not just giving it to you. Either way, it doesn't matter because he wasn't the person. I could tell you that. Sorry, spoiler. That's the only one I'll give you. In 2001, officers seized cigarette butts, napkins, and other items from Robert's trash, along with beverage cans and cigarette butts from his brother's home. In 2001 and in 2002, CODIS manager Gary Molina determined that the DNA from the items at Robert's home and at his brother's home were not a match to the profile. In 2009, Kimberly Clement, a DPS forensic scientist, was assigned to the case. Then in 2010, Clement took blood and sperm samples to make a new DNA profile. 2012, Kimberly Clement makes a call to the FBI to tell them that the DNA profile for Mildred McKinney was a match to 53-year-old Stephen Thomas. Okay, sorry. More likely than not, Stephen Thomas. Detective John Foster, who took over the case in 2007, got a search warrant for Stephen's DNA and met him at his parents' home in Dallas. He told Foster that he was originally from Austin and that he lived there for most of his life, before moving to Garland, Texas. When Foster questioned him about his life in 1980, he told him that he was working construction jobs as well as working for his brother's pest control company. At the time, he lived about 9 miles away from Mildred's home and says that he does know that area of the town. But when he showed a photo of the home, he tells Foster that he has no idea who McKinney is, he has no memory of being in her home, and he has never had sex with her. When Foster asks him if he ever ejaculated in a home while he was performing his pest control duties, he becomes very offended by that question. It was at that point that Foster showed him pictures of the home and the body, along with a picture of the ribbon that was tied around her thumb. Further explaining that the DNA profile from the ribbon came back as a hit for corresponding to his DNA. Okay, so here we go. Oh God, this is just... Stephen tells Foster that he would meet multiple women in bars and have sex with them, saying that he may have met her out in a bar and had sex with her, but that he never went into her home. Okay, so here's the thing. Is there absolutely a 0% chance that 73-year-old Mildred McKinney was out at a bar at night? She met 22-year-old Stephen, because he was 22 at the time. So she meets 22-year-old Stephen Thomas, has sex with him, goes home, and then gets killed by a different person? Okay, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibilities, but is very, 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 very highly unlikely all of that played out this way. I mean, you'd probably have a better chance of winning the Mega Millions 3 times. That's all I'm saying. Foster then asked Stephen Thomas for a voluntary sample of his DNA, but when he refused, officers showed him the search warrant and they were able to collect 4 swabs of saliva. David Foster then interviews Stephen's brother, associates, and parents. His brother William voluntarily provided swab samples, finger and palm prints. At trial, William testified that in 1980 he did own a pest control company and his brother was an employee for him at the time. He told police that he no longer had his business records from 1980, but at that time his mother, who was the office manager, commented about how so their mom is the office manager, and at that time he remembers his mother commenting about how the murder of the elderly woman was one of their customers. Dr. Clement determined that the probability of DNA profile belonging to someone other than Stephen was 1 in 10.88 trillion for Caucasians, 1 in 204.7 trillion for blacks, and 1 in 172.4 trillion for Spanish. The testing also excluded Stephen's brother William, Henry Lee Lucas, Otis Toole, and Robert Stapleton. Stephen Shockey, a fellow inmate of Stephen in 2013, testified that while the two were incarcerated together and hanging out in the day room, Stephen would begin to have little outbursts, he says. He would mumble about being high on, the white stuff you put up your nose, going into a house in the early hours of the morning, restraining the occupant, taking some money and jewelry, and then planning to blame the whole thing on a man named Glenn because he was already dead anyway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Stephen Thomas's past and how he's been a pretty sucky person for a pretty long time. A high school friend of Stephen's by the name Russell said that he was a pretty typical kid, but that later on in his high school career, he got into the devil's lettuce. It wasn't until after they graduated school that he got into the harder stuff like dust, speed, and prescription pills. He recalls a night back in 1980 when Stephen showed up to his house with a full-sized kitchen bag of loose prescription pills that he wanted to store at his home. When he questions Stephen about where all these pills came from, he tells him that he would steal pills from the customers of his brother's pest control company, and then he would go on to the 1980s version of WebMD to see if he has stolen anything good before selling it. At the time, Stephen was dating a woman named Cindy, who happened to be best friends with Russell's wife, Sharon. He talks about how they were at a house party at Stephen's parents' house one night when Stephen and Cindy get into an argument and Stephen puts his hands around Cindy's throat. He says that he and Sharon took Cindy out of the home and back to their apartment for her safety. Going on to say that Stephen would later call him and tell him that he was going to burn down his apartment for taking Cindy home with him. Despite this encounter, Russell remains friends with Stephen, and Stephen and Cindy would go on to marry and have a son in 1986 that the couple would name Blake. Russell would end up becoming Blake's godfather. Stephen and Cindy began dating in high school. In the beginning of their relationship, she described him as good-looking and kind. As time went on, he began to belittle her, and she would become scared to anger him. She constantly had bruises on her, and he would use the prescription pills that he was stealing from the customers when he was supposed to be watching baby Blake. And when they would argue, he would disappear for days at a time. The final straw for Cindy, though, was one day when 3-year-old Blake was playing with chalk, and he started pretending to use it as Daddy's snort straw. Kids see everything. It's crazy. Kids pick up on so much. Cindy and Stephen would finally divorce in the late 80s or early 90s. Even after their separation, though, Cindy would stay in contact with Stephen because he would provide her with prescription pills, and this was something that Cindy struggled with. No shame. It wasn't until she met her current husband, a man by the name of Kirk Rich, that she was finally able to cut off all communication with Stephen. When Stephen realized that Cindy was dating Kirk, he lost it. He forced his way into Cindy's home, threw her up against a wall, ripped a necklace off her neck, and threw items around her kitchen. After the incident, Cindy sought an order of protection. During the hearing for the protection order, Stephen threatened Kirk, which is the husband, and kicked Cindy in the leg. So it should probably come as no surprise that Stephen did not respect this protection order whatsoever. When Cindy would take Blake to school, Stephen would park his truck by her car and throw things at it. On one occasion, he pulled up next to her and made the throat slashing motion with his finger. Blake testified that one time when he was under the age of 7, he was visiting with his father. He says that his father took so much of the white stuff that you put up your nose that he was not able to wake him up. Another time when Blake was in the 9th grade, he was visiting with his father. So by this time, Stephen is living with a man by the name of John Lowenthal. He says that Stephen, John, and Stephen's girlfriend were all doing the white stuff when Stephen's girlfriend took too much and she began to OD. He says his father grabbed John, held a knife up to him, and told him that if something happened to his girlfriend, he was going to be in trouble. He says that his father took him to his friend's house and left him there. He tells the court one more story about his encounters with his father. He says that Stephen told him that he was going to give him a choice. He would either kill his stepdad, Kirk, or throw a Molotov cocktail into his mother's car while she and his little sister were inside of it. That's a special kind of garbage. I just want you to know, if you say something like that to your child, you're a special kind of scumbag. In 1992, while Stephen was golfing at Inks Lake, he got into an argument with another man by the name of Tyrone Claiborne. Stephen took his golf club out and began to beat Claiborne over the head with it, causing a serious knee injury and caving in his skull. Stephen's neighbor, Jeff Bingham, says that in 1993, he woke up in the middle of the night and saw Stephen shoot a bullet into his car door with a shotgun. Unsure of why Stephen was doing this, Jeff decided to phone the police. When police arrived, Stephen told them that he had no idea what they were talking about, that he was asleep in the bed with his son. Officers didn't really buy this story, though, because they spotted a box of ammunition in the car. In the end, Stephen would end up being charged with criminal mischief. Also in 1993, a man by the name of William Rivers was the maintenance man for the apartment complex that Stephen was living in. So, the maintenance man is informed by some of the residents, I guess, that concerning behavior is taking place in Stephen's duplex. So, Rivers decided to report it, and as a result, Stephen was asked to leave the complex. He says that after this, Stephen called him and shouted profanities at him. He had his house shut up, his tires were slashed, and his roommate's tires were slashed. Then around 2000, a woman by the name of Janet began dating Stephen. She says that at first she found him charming, but after a while she began to fear him. Sounds a lot like his first wife. On one occasion during an argument, he pushed her up against a wall and twisted her arm. On a second occasion, during a sexual encounter, Stephen began pushing down on her chest so hard that it felt as if she couldn't breathe. When she began screaming at him and telling him to stop, he looked up at her and said, "What?" Janet says that rather than confront him, she just pretended that it was nothing. She also said that she believes he kicked her small puppy once, and she also witnessed him shoot several baby goats once. In 2010, Stephen was dating and living with a new woman by the name of Joyce Clayton. One night, Joyce's son, Michael, gets locked out of the house for the entire night. So the following morning, obviously he's pissed off. Who wouldn't be pissed off about that, right? And he confronts Stephen about it, and an argument ensues. Stephen shoves Michael, drops him to the ground, and begins choking him. Then he begins banging his head against the floor. Of course, Mom is freaking out at this point, obviously. After it stopped, Stephen stood up, grabbed him by the leg, and tried to drag him out of the house before Michael became dizzy and passed out. Michael, same as ex-girlfriend Janet, stated that after it was all done, Stephen acted as if nothing happened. When Stephen spoke with the investigating officer, he admitted to putting his hands around Michael's throat and applying pressure. He also admitted to grabbing Michael by the leg and trying to drag him out of the house, later telling the officer that with regards to putting his hands around Michael's throat, he did apply pressure, but it was not a lot. Further stating that he knew it wasn't a lot because he knows what it feels like to choke the wind, breath, or air out of someone. Well, if that's not just everything we need to know right there. Okay, so, to be fair, Stephen did have a few people speak on his behalf. A family friend named David Dixon said that he attended many parties at Stephen's parents' house and that Stephen was always a very gracious host. Ryan Shook became very good friends with Stephen in middle school and said that Stephen was very supportive to him when his mother was killed. Sarah Thomas is Stephen's niece, and she said that Stephen would watch her a lot when her dad was out of town, and she looked to him as a second father. Yeah, blah, 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 right? Blah, 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 blah. Because there was a more than 30-year gap between the murder and the trial, a lot of valuable evidence was lost. However, what was not lost was a fingerprint on Mildred's alarm clock that matched Stephen's and sperm cells that matched Stephen's. On Monday, October 27th, 2014, after more than 3 decades, Stephen Thomas is found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. All right, guys, if you're still here, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you, and I appreciate you so, so, so very much. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you haven't yet, and you feel so inclined to, because it really helps me out. I really, really appreciate it. And until next time, stay safe out there.